Long Beach, California. October 1967. The 5th Annual International Karate Championships, organized by Ed Parker at the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium. 800 people in the seats. 300 fighters on the floor. The best karate practitioners in North America, assembled in one building for one day, to settle the question that the entire sport had been arguing about for the previous 12 months. The question was simple. It had one answer. And almost everybody in that auditorium already knew what the answer was going to be before the first match was called. The answer's name was Joe Louis. Joe Louis was 22 years old that October. 6 feet tall, 185 pounds, a United States Marine who had returned from a tour in Okinawa 2 years earlier carrying a black belt in Shorin Ryu Karate, and a way of moving that nobody in American competition had seen before. He was not the most technically refined fighter in the room. He did not need to be. What he had instead was something that technical refinement cannot produce and cannot replace, which was a combination of speed, power, and aggression so complete that opponents did not lose to Joe Louis so much as they discovered, in real time, that their understanding of how fast a human being could move had been wrong. He had gone 57-0 in tournament competition. He had not been seriously challenged in a single one of those 57 bouts. He had won the previous year's Grand Champion title at Long Beach with a performance that veteran tournament judges described in the kind of language men use when they are watching something they know they will remember. In the months between that tournament and this one, Joe Louis had done something that champions of his particular temperament tend to do, which was to talk. He gave interviews to Black Belt magazine. He spoke at seminars. He told other fighters, in the specific casual way that very gifted people sometimes speak about the people they expect to beat, that the field at Long Beach in 1967 was not going to be different from the field at Long Beach in 1966. He was not wrong about most of it. The field was largely the same. The judges were the same. The floor was the same. The 800 people in the seats had the same general expectation about how the afternoon was going to end. What was different, and what Joe Louis had either not noticed or not taken seriously enough, was a fighter from Torrance, California named Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris was 27 years old. 5 feet 11, 168 pounds. He had trained in Tang Soo Do during his service in the United States Air Force, stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, and had continued training when he returned to California, opening a string of small schools that he ran himself while competing on weekends. His record was good. It was not Joe Louis's record. He had won the middleweight title at Long Beach in 1966 before losing the Grand Champion bout to Alan Steen. He was known in the tournament circuit as a precise, controlled fighter with excellent timing and a back-fist combination that more experienced judges had started to pay specific attention to. He was not, in October 1967, considered a serious threat to Joe Louis for the Grand Champion title. This was the consensus. It was held by the judges, by the other competitors, and by Joe Louis himself, who had mentioned Norris by name in one of the black belt interviews that spring and described him, in the manner of a man who has not spent much time thinking about what he is saying, as a solid regional competitor who had not yet faced anyone who would test him. Chuck Norris had read that interview. He had not responded to it. He had not called the magazine. He had not sought out Joe Louis at the subsequent tournaments where their paths crossed. He had shown up at those tournaments, competed in his division, won what he needed to win, and gone home. He trained in the morning before his schools opened and he trained in the evening after they closed. He had been doing this for 2 years. The specific quality that this kind of preparation produces in a fighter is not excitement, and it is not confidence in the way that word is usually meant. It is something quieter and more useful than either of those things. It is the knowledge, accumulated through repetition until it lives in the body rather than the mind, that you have prepared for this specific problem and that the preparation was real. He arrived at the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium on the morning of the tournament, paid his entry fee, and took a seat in the warm-up area with the other competitors. He wore a plain white uniform. He did not seek out Joe Louis before the matches began. He stretched and he waited. The preliminary rounds proceeded the way preliminary rounds proceed at a tournament of this size, which is to say that the serious fighters moved through them quickly and the judges spent most of their attention on the later rounds. Norris won his middleweight division without significant difficulty. Louis won his heavyweight division in the same manner. The Grand Champion bout, as it had been the year before and the year before that, would be contested between the division winners who had survived to that point. By mid-afternoon, the bracket had produced its inevitable result. The two men who would fight for grand champion were Joe Louis and Chuck Norris. The floor cleared. The 800 people in the seats arranged themselves in the specific attentive stillness of an audience that knows it is about to watch something it came to see. The judges took their positions. The ring coordinator called both fighters to the center of the floor. Louis walked to the line with the unhurried ease of a man approaching a task he had performed many times and expected to perform without difficulty. He was the defending grand champion. He was 22 years old. He had not lost a tournament bout in 2 years. He looked at Chuck Norris across the 3 feet of open floor between them with an expression that several people who were seated close enough to see it would describe later in almost identical terms, which was the expression of a man who is present and prepared but who has already, somewhere in the part of the mind that runs below conscious thought, made a determination about how this is going to end. The referee called the bout to begin. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be discussed in the American karate community for the following 4 decades, and the discussion would always return to the same observation, which was that the person in that auditorium who was least surprised by the outcome was the person who won. Norris did not rush. He did not come at Louis with the kind of aggressive forward pressure that most fighters used against him, because most fighters who came at Louis with aggressive forward pressure discovered that Louis's counter timing was faster than they had accounted for, and that the discovery arrived at a point in the bout when there was not enough time left to revise the strategy. Norris had watched Louis fight. He had studied what Louis did to fighters who came forward, and he had made a decision about distance that he had been practicing for 6 months in the mornings before his schools opened and in the evenings after they closed. The decision was this. He was going to stay at the exact distance where Louis's combination could not be set without a step, and he was going to make Louis pay for every step with a counter that arrived before the combination could complete. This is easier to describe than it is to execute. The distance Norris had chosen was not a large margin. It was measured in inches, not feet, and holding it against a fighter of Louis's quality required a level of spatial awareness and foot speed that most competitors in that room, watching from the seats, could not fully appreciate from where they were sitting. The senior competitors in the front rows understood it. They had been watching tournament karate long enough to recognize what they were seeing, which was a fighter who had done a very specific kind of homework and was now applying it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it until the rehearsal was indistinguishable from the thing itself. Louis attacked. He attacked the way he always attacked, with the combination of speed and commitment that had won him 57 consecutive bouts, and what he found was that the target he was attacking had moved 3 inches in the quarter second before contact, and that in moving 3 inches the target had also delivered a straight rear punch to his chest that the judges scored as a clean point. Louis reset. The crowd in the front rows made a small sound. Not a large sound. The sound that knowledgeable people make when they see something that confirms what they suspected but were not certain of. Louis attacked again. This time with a side kick that he had used to finish 11 of his tournament victories in the preceding 2 years. The kick was fast. It was faster than most fighters in that room could have defended against. Chuck Norris was not where the kick was going. He had moved off the line in the same quarter second and scored with a back fist to the side of Louis's head that the judges scored again. 2 points. Louis had not scored. The 800 people in the seats were no longer making the specific sound of a crowd that has already decided what it expects to see. They were making a different sound. The sound of people revising. Louis pressed. He was a champion, and champions do not abandon their method in the middle of a bout simply because the method has not worked twice. He pressed with more commitment, more speed, more of the controlled aggression that had made him the most feared competitor in the country. And each time he pressed, the result was the same result, which was that Norris was not where the attack was going and the counter was already scored before Louis could recover his position. The exchange was not one-sided in the way that Louis's previous grand champion bouts had been one-sided, which was to say overwhelmingly. It was one-sided in a quieter and more precise way. It was the kind of one-sided that the people in the front rows would tell their students about for the next 30 years, because what they were watching was not a better athlete defeating a lesser athlete. What they were watching was a specific answer to a specific question, delivered with a composure that communicated something that no interview and no boast and no reputation could communicate, which was that the answer had been prepared in advance. The bout ended. The judges' flags went up. Chuck Norris was grand champion. He stood at the center of the floor with his hands at his sides. He did not raise his arms. He did not turn to the crowd. He accepted the trophy from Ed Parker with a bow and held it without displaying it and stood there in the flat afternoon light of the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium while the 800 people in the seats processed what they had watched. Joe Louis stood at the edge of the floor. His expression was the expression that very few people in that room had ever seen on his face before, because very few people had ever given him a reason to wear it. It was not anger. It was the expression of a man who had just been shown the answer to a question he had believed was already settled. The specific thing that happened after the trophy ceremony was the thing that was retold longest and most carefully by the people who witnessed it. Louis walked across the floor to where Norris was standing. He stopped in front of him. He looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, in a voice that did not carry to the seats but that three people standing close enough to hear would each recount separately and consistently over the years, that he wanted to know how Norris had moved the way he had moved on the third and fourth exchanges. Not a challenge. Not an excuse. A genuine question from a man who had spent 2 years not meeting anyone who could produce information he did not already have. Chuck Norris answered the question. He answered it the way he had answered every question about his training, which was directly and without embellishment, the way a man answers when the subject is something he has actually thought about rather than something he is performing for an audience. He talked about distance. He talked about the specific interval between Louis's weight shift and his kick extension and what could be done in the half second that interval created if you had practiced the response until the practice was faster than the thought. He talked about it for about 3 minutes while both men stood on the edge of the tournament floor as the crowd filed out around them. Several of the people who were still in the auditorium at that point and who had positioned themselves to overhear said later that they had never watched Joe Louis listen to another fighter the way he listened that afternoon. Louis was not a man who received instruction easily or often. He was 22 years old and had not lost in 2 years and was constitutionally the kind of person who taught rather than learned. He stood there in the Long Beach Municipal Auditorium at the end of the afternoon that had just revised his understanding of his own situation, and he listened to Chuck Norris explain the thing that Norris had spent 6 months preparing, and the listening was the kind of listening that people do when the information arriving is not comfortable but is accurate, and they know it is accurate, and they are deciding whether to do something with it. Louis did do something with it. He sought out Bruce Lee shortly after Long Beach and began training with him privately, a period of instruction that would change his fighting entirely and produce the full-contact competitor who would go on to win the inaugural World Professional Karate Championship in '74. He would become one of the most complete fighters the sport had ever produced. The path to that fighter ran through an afternoon in Long Beach where a man who had decided in advance what was going to happen discovered that someone else had decided differently and had done the work to make the decision real. The 1967 Long Beach International Karate Championships are listed in the record books with Chuck Norris as grand champion. The record books do not list what Joe Louis asked him on the edge of that floor, or what Chuck Norris answered. They do not list the specific quality of the silence that preceded the question, or what it meant that a man who had been undefeated for 2 years and had said in print that the man standing across from him was a solid regional competitor who had not yet faced anyone who would test him chose, at the end of the afternoon, to ask that man a genuine question and stand still long enough to hear the answer. The record books are not where that part of the story lives. It lives in the way it was told, for the next 40 years, by the people who were in the front rows when the flags went up.